The notorious Moderna trial. What have we? Here we can see that it lowered COVID-19, severe COVID-19 too. The highlighted sentence here is the strict definition for COVID-19 in this Moderna vaccination trial. Not one case of COVID-19 was diagnosed without a PCR positive result for SARS-CoV-2. The highlighted sentence on the screen here is the definition of severe COVID-19, which too needs a positive PCR test result for SARS-CoV-2. So as we can see from the headline or the front page billboard, maybe you'd call it, of this trial, the vaccine seemed to lower the chances of the recipient being diagnosed with COVID-19. As we know, given what we've seen from the definition of COVID-19 in this trial, either the vaccinated people were less likely to pass positive for the PCR test of SARS-CoV-2, or they had less of the symptoms that are required for the primary and even the secondary definition of COVID-19, or perhaps a mix of both. They were less likely to pass positive for the PCR test, and they also were less likely to be found with the symptoms associated with COVID-19 in this trial as they have defined them. How can we tell if the vaccine recipients actually had a lower amount of the symptoms associated with COVID-19 in this trial? Symptoms associated with COVID-19 as they've been listed. These are all the symptoms associated with COVID-19 in this trial. You might call them adverse events. These were recorded throughout the whole duration of the trial, which is over 700 days. But we've also got this data, which is actually called adverse events. Just the serious ones were monitored through to day 759. The only issues or adverse events are called serious adverse events that are listed in this trial that were recorded after 28 days of a vaccination or an injection. And here we can see that 7 cases of pneumonia in the placebo group were presented and 5 in the mRNA group. And like I said, this is the only data involving quotes of cellular stress or damage that pertains to a period longer than 28 days after any of the vaccinations. The vaccinations both occurred within 1 month of the trial beginning. This data seems to be data that was collected over 759 days. And so does this data pertaining to the cases of COVID-19. So we have these two. And this is the closest overlap I found between these two sets of data, was evidence of pneumonia. See how there's 0 in the mRNA group throughout the whole trial? There's 0 evidence of pneumonia. Well, this is evidence that this in fact is only the symptom data of those who were able to pass the case definition of COVID-19 in this trial. Make no mistake, this is definitely just the data of those who were able to pass positive for the case definition of COVID-19 in this trial. There was pneumonia in the mRNA group. There was 5 accounts of it, but for some reason it's not listed in the COVID details, probably because these cases of pneumonia didn't pass positive on the PCR test, or because they didn't have clinical evidence. And maybe the placebo recipients who ended up being listed with COVID-19 were only found with clinical evidence of pneumonia because they were enlisted into a more thorough examination after passing positive for SARS-CoV-2 on the PCR test and meeting the case definition of COVID-19. This is data that goes for 28 days after the second vaccination. There's also data of the same kind after the first vaccination. I'm just pointing out that there were headaches listed here for the mRNA group. I'm wondering maybe they were the headaches that the people who had them, they didn't pass positive on the PCR test, so they aren't included in the data of people who were diagnosed with COVID-19 here. Look, let's do it again with fever. If we look at the highest grade of fever, there's 13 entries of the highest grades of fever in the mRNA vaccine group, which occurred within 28 days after the second vaccination, which is a lot more than the placebo. We can't even tell if the vaccinated people had more headaches or any symptom associated with COVID-19 throughout this trial. We can literally only compare the people who ended up being diagnosed with COVID-19. If you're wondering what it means as baseline SARS-CoV-2 status, some people were positive, most were negative. This is to do with the blood sample, the serological survey. They're looking for the SARS-CoV-2 antibody. This has nothing to do with COVID-19 diagnoses. You can see that whenever the Moderna team analysed the participants in this trial to see who had the SARS-CoV-2 antibodies, there was no difference between the placebo and the vaccinated group. We seem to be presented with a clear difference between those who are vaccinated and those who are injected with salt water as to the chances of passing positive on this RT-PCR mechanism. As you can see, I've underlined in red that at the second dose of vaccination, it seems that everyone was tested with the PCR for SARS-CoV-2, and there was already a clear difference setting in. It states clearly that there's a secondary definition for this table of COVID-19, which involves no symptoms at all, just a positive PCR result. We've also got data listed for people who had no symptoms at all, but a positive PCR result specifically around the time of those two.
Can go on speaking.
From what we know, from what we can gather, we can say, if we trust everything that the report has stated, we can say that more vaccinated people were diagnosed with COVID-19. We cannot say who had more coughing, who had more fever, who had more fatigue overall, at least not 28 days after the second dose. Only other things are monitored after that, like serious adverse events and the symptoms of the people who had COVID-19. And for all we know, those symptoms such as coughing and fever were recorded throughout the whole 759 days. I don't know, but all we are shown is the coughing data of those who were diagnosed with COVID-19. For all we know, the COVID-19 vaccinated people had more coughing. Perhaps they had more of the symptoms associated with COVID-19, and perhaps they didn't. Perhaps it was the same, perhaps it was less. We don't know. But we should stress about overall cellular damage, not just coughing, and especially not just the coughing of those who ended up passing this criteria and being diagnosed.